The Architecture of the Heart by Michael Runyon. In the swirling valley of cobalt and ochre, where the wind hums in thick, visible ribbons of indigo, lived Self. She was a creature of deep internal resonance, yet she felt like a house with no walls. Her heart was a lantern of hope, bright and flickering, but it lacked a steady place to rest. She wandered through groves of cypress trees that twisted like dark flames, toward a moon made of butter and yellow paint. One evening, as the stars spun in the great golden wheels across the firmament, a stranger appeared. He was named Glint. He moved with a shimmering grace. His voice was a melody of silver promise and golden futures. He didn't talk of the earth or the work of the hands. He spoke only of the heights they would reach together. Self felt the intoxicating pull of his words, a sudden rush of warmth that felt like sunrise in the middle of the night. Glint was a master of the mirror. He reflected back everything Self had ever longed to hear. He spoke of a trust that was a sacred gift, something to be bestowed in a single magnificent moment. He made the idea of caution seem like a dusty old-fashioned burden. "Why wait for the slow turning of seasons," he whispered, "when we can fly today?" Self, weary of her own solitude and desperate for the anchor he promised, decided to bypass the slow labor of knowing. She believed that trust was a bridge made of air and intent, rather than wood and stone. She looked into his bright, shallow eyes and felt a surge of unearned certainty. "I believe in you," she said, the words falling from her lips like the petals before a storm. From her neck, Self untied a velvet cord, holding a golden key, the key to her inner garden, the place where her most fragile truths were kept. She handed it to Glint without asking for a history, a reference, or even a single proof of character. She gave him the power to enter her most private sanctuary, believing that the act of giving would make him worthy of receiving the gift. For a few brief days, the world was a riot of color. They sat in the garden, and Glint promised to build a palace of glass where the flowers would never fade. Self basked in the warmth, ignoring the fact that he never reached for a tool or stained his hands with the soil. She was drunk on the sweetness of unearned intimacy, a beautiful house built on the shifting sands of a stranger's charm. But unearned trust is a debt that eventually demands payment. One morning, the sky turned a flat, cold gray. Self woke to find the garden gate standing open wide, swaying on hinges that had been forced. Glint was gone. He had not taken her gold or her silver. He had taken the light from her lantern and left the garden stripped of its color. He walked away into the midst, leaving no path, for he had never intended to plant any roots. The aftermath was a hollow ache that vibrated through Selva's very bones. She stood in her ruined garden, realized that by giving the key so freely, she had invited the theft. The betrayal was not just Glint's departure, but her own abandonment of discernment. The flowers were trampled, and the soil was dry. She saw now that words are weightless, and a house built on them cannot withstand even a gentle breeze. Weeks passed in the blur of indigo shadows. Self repaired the gate, but she did so with a heart of stone. She vowed never to trust again, for the pain of the hollow was worse than the pain of the dark. She sat on her porch, watching the stars turn, seeing them no longer as wanderers, but as distant, cold fires that promised nothing and gave less. Then, without fanfare or a silver tongue, Cairn arrived. He didn't come with promises. He came with a heavy bag of stones and a weathered wooden shovel. He didn't look at Self or ask for her key. He simply walked to the edge of her property, where the wall had crumbled during the years of neglect, and he began to work. Self watched him from her window. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you want?" she called out one afternoon. Cairn did not stop his work. He merely looked up, wiped the sweat from his brow, and said, "The wall's broken. It shouldn't stay that way." He didn't ask for a reward or a seat at her table. He simply returned to his stones. Every morning, at the same hour when the sun began to swirl in the sky, Cairn was there. He worked through the heat and the rain. He was consistent, as rhythmic as a heartbeat. Self waited for the moment he would ask for something, for the moment his charm would slip and reveal a hollow interior. But there was no charm, only the steady, honest thud of stone meeting mortar. By the third week, the wall was waist high. It was not a wall built of glass or air, but of heavy gray river stones that Cairn had carried up from the valley one by one. Self began to notice the calluses on his hands and the way he checked the level of each stone twice. He was building something meant to last, something that required time as its primary ingredient. One day, Self walked out to the wall. She didn't bring the key, but she brought a pitcher of cool water. They sat in the shade of a cypress tree. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Cairn drank the water slowly. He didn't fill the silence with the talk of the future. He talked only of the stones, of how each one had a face and a place where it fit the best. Self realized that she was beginning to trust the sound of his footsteps before she trusted the man himself. Trust was not a sudden illumination, she discovered. It was the accumulation of evidence. It was the way he closed the gate gently every evening. It was the way he returned the shovel to the same spot every night. It was the profound reliability of the mundane. Eventually, Self picked up a stone. It was heavier than she expected, cold and unyielding. Cairn showed her how to find its center of gravity. "A wall built too fast will lean," he told her, his voice low and steady. "But a wall built with the weight of time will hold the earth in place." Together, they began to work, their hands moving in a synchronized dance of effort and intention. Months passed, and the garden began to bloom again, but this time the flowers were rooted deep. They weren't the flash-bright blossoms of Glint's era, but hardy, resilient things that knew how to find water in the dark. Self found that she no longer felt like a house with no walls. She felt like a citadel, built stone by stone, day by day, through the shared labor of presence. One evening, a great heat wave hit the valley. The air was thick and shimmering, and the work was exhausting. But Cairn did not falter. He simply slowed his pace, ensuring that even in the fatigue, the work was done correctly. Self watched him and realized that trust is not a feeling you have when things are easy. It is the knowledge of how a person will act when the things are hard. Then came the great storm, the one that haunted Selv's dreams. The sky turned a bruised electric purple, and the stars were swallowed by a whirlpool of black and white clouds. The wind howled with the voice of 1,000 betrayals, threatening to tear the very roof from the house. In the past, Self would have hid in the cellar, alone and trembling. But as the first gust struck, she found Cairn already at the door. He didn't make a grand speech about protection. He simply pressed his broad shoulder against the heavy oak and stayed there. Self stepped forward and added her weight to his. They stood together in the howling dark, two bodies against the chaos, anchored by months of reliability that had preceded this moment. The storm raged for hours, but the wall held. The garden, protected by the stones they had laid, remained intact. When the morning finally broke, pale and washed clean, Cairn did not ask for a key. He simply went to the kitchen and brewed a pot of tea. He handed Selv a cup, his hands steady and calloused. There was no need for the key anymore, for the doors were already open. Selv looked at her own hands, stained with the dust of the valley and the grit of the stones. She understood now that trust is not a gift you give to someone else. It is a structure you inhabit together. It is grown, not given. It is a mountain that no storm can move, built in the quiet, boring, consistent moments of showing up. They walked out into the new day. Two pillars in an architecture of the heart.